Have you ever felt like you were holding the tension of life? I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and thanks for listening to the Parable Podcast. Joining me is school psychologist and podcaster Molly Evans, who has learned her own parable lesson while living in Bangkok. Molly shared how this perspective provided her with valuable tools going forward in life.
Just to be really brutally honest with God. And I think in that moment, it was me saying, I don't think you're good. Like, based on what I'm surrounded by right now, I'm having a really hard time believing that you are good. And I don't know what to do with that.
Here's my conversation with Molly Evans. Well, one of the ways I enjoy finding my next guest is from previous guests. And so today is kind of fun because I have a sister that is here today. You may remember her sister, Emily, from episode 126, Emily Riley. And today we are talking with Molly Evans. Molly, welcome to the Parable Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so fun to be here.
Well, the great thing is by having your sister, now is Emily your little sister or your big sister?
She's the middle of three, so she is younger than me.
Well, she's given me a few pieces of intel about you that she wanted to share. So she said that you are like a very brave baker and that you have named your KitchenAid. I would love to know more about this.
Yes, I named my KitchenAid Mabel. She's beautiful. She's like a teal color. She's like the Joanna Gaines KitchenAid or whatever. And I found her on Facebook Marketplace, brand new, and came with all the attachments and everything. It was like probably the most adult purchase I've made. So I call her Mabel.
Okay, so would you say that your baking skills, while they're tagged brave, is that like because you would be on like that cake show? I forgot what it's called on Netflix. Or do you feel like, gosh, I could bake for a living?
Well, the baking competition shows, I don't know if I'm cut out for that because I'm a bit of a perfectionist and it takes me like 4 times as long to do the actual recipe because I'm like really careful. So the time crunch of those stresses me out. So I'm not sure I could do that. But I think I would imagine that Emily calls me brave because I'll just like find a recipe and give it a shot. So most recently I tried my hand at pavlova, which is like a meringue that you bake in the oven and it's like marshmallowy and really delicious. It's actually quite easy, but it looks really fancy. That's been my latest baking endeavor.
Now, she also says that you are an extreme karaokeer, okay? And there was a recent cruise ship experience that you were on, and I'd love to know more about that.
Yes, I am a self-proclaimed karaoke enthusiast for sure. I'm very passionate about it. And I developed a love for karaoke when I lived overseas in Asia. And since coming back to the States, like my favorite thing is karaoke in dive bars because of the characters that it attracts. Yeah. But yes, on the cruise, Emily and her husband and I and a friend of ours went on a cruise recently. And I honestly, like probably 60% of the reason why I went on the cruise was because I hear that they have karaoke like every night. So it was so much fun. Emily is also an incredible singer, so it's really fun to like get to do it with her. But yeah, I have a running list on my phone of songs that I just kind of have ready to go. And there's not a whole lot in the world that makes me as excited or happy as karaoke does.
What is your go-to karaoke song? Because sometimes when I get to karaoke, like my mind blanks and I'm like, I know there's so many songs. So is there like a catalog that you have ready to go at any waking moment?
I mean, that's why I started keeping this list on my phone because most people will, you will forget. So right now I'd say my go-to is Alone by Heart. So I like the like older kind of ballads.
I love it so much because I think that like it just shows what Emily also shared about you. She's like a diamond, which is very beautiful to say, but you are multifaceted and she just loves your heart and you're advocating for other people on the fringes and the marginalized. And yeah, she's a diamond. So we all have like these multifaceted parts of us. And so I'm so excited that I was able to like hear those couple of things before we get started today. So you said you lived overseas. Where where was like that jump for you? Have you always thought about doing that, or was that something that came out of the blue?
I would say it came out of the blue a little bit. I went on my first kind of overseas trip that was sort of ministry related when I was in college. And it was kind of at a time where I was like, okay, I'm nearing the end of college. My life doesn't look like I thought it would. I'm still single. I don't know what's going to happen. So I was like, what if I just go and spend the summer in Ecuador? And I partnered with a gal down there who runs a children's home and just went and spent the summer with her and kind of was hoping for some answers about what was coming next. And it just sparked this interest in wanting to be overseas. And so I ended up figuring out how to go do my student teaching overseas. I came home from that trip and was like, okay, what are my options? And the 5th grade teacher from a school in Indonesia just happened to have come home on furlough at the same time. And we had lunch one day and she was like, well, I don't know what your schedule is, but I am heading back in a year and I would love to have a student teacher. And I literally was like, well, I don't really know where Indonesia is. So I should probably figure that out first. So that was kind of the beginning of it all. So I went to Indonesia about a year later, thinking that it was just going to be a 4-month thing and I would like get it out of my system and move on to what, I was really supposed to do. And then I got to Indonesia and it was like God just like unwrapped this version of myself that I didn't know existed. I think maybe my family had seen it or, I think other people maybe had gotten glimpses of that courage and that adventure loving spirit, but I just had no idea it was there. And so it was amazing, just really incredible to be outside my comfort zone, to be living in a Muslim country, to be meeting all of these people who had committed their lives to working in ministry and doing some like really kind of fringy work with Muslims. And then my relationship with God just like exploded from there too. So I was in Indonesia for about 4 years. I taught 4th grade and then moved up to 5th grade. And I loved the students. They were from all over the world. I made some really good friends and it was just such a precious time. It was also a season where I was introduced to more like social justice work. And so God just kind of started stirring in me this heart to want to be a little more on the front lines of social justice. And so again, kind of just stumbled upon this opportunity in Bangkok, Thailand. I met a couple who they had been in Bangkok for a while and they were looking for someone with an education background because they had this heart to create an education program for these kids who had never been in school before. And it was like the same thing. I had coffee with the wife one day and she was like, well, I don't know what your schedule is, but we're ready to have you whenever you're ready. And so it was about a year later that I ended up moving to Bangkok. I did a 6-month internship with them and then signed on for 3 years and helped them create a really cool education program and did some English teaching and started a scholarship program. And it was amazing and really difficult. So I was overseas for about 8 years total.
You used the word courage and something that maybe you didn't even realize you had. Maybe you didn't realize how much you needed. Because one thing you were already, it seems like you were in college. And so were you already living on campus or were you living with your family still?
I was living off campus, but not with my family. So yeah I had already
so
kind of
you've
been
already
on my own.
like experienced that, but then like to completely transition to go into another part of the world. And I don't know if you've experienced other cultures yet or been immersed in that way. Tell me what like you learned about the courage that you needed to take that first journey to Indonesia, but then also again to Bangkok.
Just the fact that I was doing it on my own was, I think, a big piece of all of that. And it's funny because even looking back, it's a little bit like, wow, what compelled me to do that? Like it's hard to imagine even now. But I think there was something about like, okay, God, what are we going to do? Like, what's next? Because I knew that I wanted to be in education and that was like a no-brainer. But I think my picture of what that looked like was so narrow. Then I asked the question, okay, what are we doing? And it was almost like God was like, I'm so glad you asked. Let me show you let me show you. And I think it was just so surprising and just this really cool invitation. And that's just kind of been the way that my story has unfolded time and time again. This space of like, okay, God, what's next? And what's the next right thing? And I get this invitation and it feels scary and there's a lot of doubt. I think we're all pretty good at it, but good at creating the worst case scenario or, you know, a whole list of reasons why this is a terrible idea or it's not going to work or I'm going to fail or whatever. And I think even in the invitation and in that list, he's like, okay, yep, I hear that. And also here's what's true. So
that's so good. Well, I have definitely more questions, but I'm curious to see if this like connects in some way to the parable story that you're going to share with us. So, Molly, why don't you go ahead and share what your parable story is with us today?
You know, I was trying to think a little bit about a lesson that I've learned. And the one that really sticks with me that I feel like is an ongoing lesson and one that also I get to use almost every day is I feel like God has given me this ability to hold two things at the same time, whether that's like two emotions, two truths, but really kind of standing in the gap between two things that are kind of difficult or that can be challenging. And I think one of the clear times that happened was actually when I was living in Bangkok. So like I said, I was working with this organization and we were ministering to children who had migrated from a neighboring country, and they had created this family business of selling roses in the red light district in the middle of the night. So the kids were the ones who were selling flowers because they were super cute and they were really good little salespeople, and they would sell flowers to the men who were in that area. So what we would do is bring school supplies and coloring supplies and things like that. And we would meet with them outside of the 7-Eleven for a little break during their work. And so we would just kind of park ourselves outside on the sidewalk of this 7-Eleven, and we would teach them colors and teach them English and do coloring and things like that. And obviously, the model of this ministry is unique, and I never imagined that I would find myself, you know, frequenting the red light district of Bangkok so often. And what I started to notice, though, was that I was really struggling with like being angry about being around these men who were there to purchase sex, and I just like I couldn't understand it. I even got to a point where I like was struggling with the anger about it, and it was kind of getting in the way of me being able to sit with these kids and focus on them. I just was like so angry and disgusted that they had to be in this space and that I had to be in close proximity with these men. And I just really villainized them and just knew like, okay, I got to do something about this because this work is not going to be sustainable if I'm just like consumed with anger. So we prayed before we went out for every outreach. And I also, just was like really asking God, like, I don't know what to do with this because I'm really angry. And yet I know that I can't hold on to this anger and do this work. So like, what's happening? Where are you? Because I think I was angry at the men, but I was also angry probably at God a little bit of like, how is it okay that children are allowed to be in this space? And I just don't know how to reconcile that. So what happened was this really beautiful kind of transformation within my heart of God just really speaking into those places. And I think that's probably the other lesson in all of this too, is that, when you're honest with God, it makes space for him to speak truth into the questions that you're asking. And I just kind of developed this heart of compassion for these men. And God was just saying, you know what, Molly, these men are just as broken as you and as the children and everybody. Like everyone is looking for belonging and they're looking to be known and they're looking for connection. And the way that these men are going about that is not great, but it really helped to like humanize them and allowed me to hold compassion and understanding for them, even in the midst of all of it. And so it was just this really interesting intro into this lesson of like, I can hold two things at the same time. I can be angry and upset about a broken world. And I can also hold compassion even for those who are seemingly the villain in the story. And it's kind of been this lesson that I've come to over and over again, whether it's anger and compassion or grief and gratitude or, confusion and trust. It's just these spaces where I'm able to kind of stand in the middle And it feels like a really valuable thing to have learned and a valuable tool, you know, especially after being overseas for so long and coming back to the States and trying to like grapple with that transition too. Like it was just this really precious tool that I feel like God cultivated in me.
Molly, I appreciate that you said that, because I think sometimes when we are in a situation, we're working through something, we feel like we can only hold one thing. We can only hold one emotion. Or also we put that on God as well. Like we can only be loving towards him. We can't be angry because he's God. Like he holds all things. I'd love to know, how long would you say like that transformation was for you? Because that's like a journey. Like that's not overnight. Like you're just like, boom, you figured it out. And I'm sure it's a process, because even it'll probably come up other points of your life. And then you're like, oh yes, I have to hold two things in this. How long did you feel like that took you to figure that out?
I would say, especially during that season, because we were venturing out probably 2 times a week. So I would say it took probably like a few weeks of just like going back out there, trying to prepare my heart for it. And I think I was also not just in the red light district, but just in Bangkok in general. You know, I was doing a lot of walking throughout the city because my budget was pretty low. So I was walking by a lot of people begging on the street. And it was just like the brokenness was just like right in my face all the time. And I couldn't get away from it. And so it was almost this like ongoing conversation with God of like, okay, I need to see you today. And I'm not really sure what it looks like to see you in the midst of all of this stuff that feels really sad and gross and terrible. And so
besides what was going on internally for you as you were figuring that out, what was God doing externally in that district with those children? Do you have any moments you're like, wow, like this was really only God?
Yeah, you know, I think a really pivotal time was we were bringing school to these kids and really building trust and relationship with the family. And the couple that I worked with had done a lot of the legwork up until that point. But what we ended up proposing to them was, look, we love doing this, but it's not really sustainable, because they were always in fear of being picked up by the police and like being deported back to their home country. And they always seemed to be living in fear and things like that. And so we were able to rent this building that was just right around the corner from the red light district, which was amazing. We had the funds to do it. And we were like, how about you send your kids to our school instead? And what if we paid you to do that? Because we understand, like, if your kids go to school, then they can't work at night. Because at that time they were working all night and sleeping all day. So if they come to school, they can't work. And we understand that they are the ones who are helping your family financially. And so what if we pay you for them to come to school instead? And it was just this really unique idea. And the fact that the family trusted us enough to make that hard decision was pretty huge. And then it just led into this like really beautiful relationship that was certainly not perfect and was messy, as all that kind of work is. But it led to transformation. And I just think the creativity of God and the importance of like really building a relationship and understanding the true needs there, I think was really cool.
It's so important, like when we think about missions and working overseas, of really building that relationship, hearing what this family needs, because somebody could go in and be like, how dare your kids be working in the red light district? But at the same time, if the family needs money, like this is the opportunity, this is the option that they have. So we have to reframe our focus and, put on those different lenses. When you were talking earlier about like you were struggling and being angry, you felt almost consumed by it. Later on, you said that like you needed to make space, because when you did make that space, like God allowed this connection, this understanding, like this download, if you will, of what he was trying to accomplish within your heart. Could you give any encouragement, any tips to somebody who's trying to juggle these two emotions right now, whatever they are for them, how they can continue to like build that space for God to move in their life?
A really important practice that I learned, from Jamie Winship. He's a preacher missionary guy. I heard a sermon of his once that kind of helped define confession. And he talks about how confession is just being honest with God. And he tells this incredible story about being fearful and just being honest and saying, God, I don't think you're bigger than this. I don't think that you can do this. I don't think that you can protect me. And then it was in that moment that God just like showed up and showed him like, yes, I can. And so that story has really stuck with me. And it's been a practice that I use a lot, like just to be really brutally honest with God. Mm-hmm. And I think in that moment, it was me saying, I don't think you're good. Based on what I'm surrounded by right now, I'm having a really hard time believing that you are good. And I don't know what to do with that. I think in my current life, I'm single and every day is a fun journey to like grapple with that. And I think in that I'm having these honest conversations or honest confession sessions with God where I'm like, you know, sometimes it feels like you forgot. Sometimes it feels like you don't really have a plan, or you left out this part of the plan for me and I don't know what to do with that. And I just think there's something really powerful about being honest with God because he can take it. And he, like you said, he holds all things. So he can hold those hard things that we're saying to him. And he's also all powerful and all loving. So he like can instantly replace it with peace. Maybe it's not instantly. Maybe it takes a little while, but you know, like I think he wants to replace it with peace. And I've just found that when I cry out to him, when I say those honest things, there's just a compassion there. And even like wisdom, you know, I think it makes space for wisdom as well to really understand and see his hand, and he wants to show himself to us. And so I think it like just makes more space for that.
Looking at your life today, what are the two things that you feel like you're holding on to the most these days?
It's a lot of like grief and gratitude. As a single person who's just getting older, like there's a lot of things that I have to grieving a life that I thought I would have that I don't, and yet being so grateful for what I do have because I get to live close to family. I'm grateful for the work that I get to do. I'm grateful for the opportunities to travel and for my friendships that I have all over the world. So I think grief and gratitude are two things. And then also trust and confusion a little bit. Because especially when it comes to like my singleness, I'm not angry about it, but I am confused about it sometimes, you know, because it just doesn't make sense sometimes. Yeah. And that's kind of an emotion that I recently just kind of put with that. So as you can see, I'm like working through it in real time, but I think that the confusion and trust thing is also an interesting space of like, man, I trust God with my story 100%. And sometimes I just get a little confused or like, I'm not really sure what's going on right now, but really trusting him anyways.
That's the honest answer. And if we really sit back and think about how the listener is feeling, I'm sure each one of us could say, yeah, I wrestle with two things. And sometimes I'm so confused, God. Like, what are you doing? Why are you allowing this? I thought this was the direction you wanted me to go. Could we talk about singleness for you for just a second? Is that cool?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So I would say growing up in, I don't know when Jesus became more than a name for you, Molly, but I grew up like in the Christian church, like 5th grade and up. I was in the culture of I kiss dating goodbye.
Yep.
I've always dreamt of being married. And like, I remember even going to a Christian college and there was a girl within the first week of school in my dorm. She's like, well, I'm just here for an MRS. And I didn't even know what she meant, but that was a Mrs. degree. And so sometimes, not everyone, I've learned the reality of this, but sometimes people like, well, if you are married, like that is the pinnacle of who you are as a person. And that is your then identity of what you're trying to attain. And I always like to remind people, remember, Jesus also single. Just a heads up there. I would love to ask you, like, because obviously there's a desire of your heart, but there's also this immense pressure as well of one aging or other people put on you. No, I don't want to date that person, Mom. Thank you. I don't want to say that about your mom, but who knows?
Yeah.
So what has that felt like? What does that look like for you in the last couple of years?
I grew up in that season of Christian culture as well. And it has certainly been a journey trying to reconcile that. Because, there was like a formula, and I'm Enneagram 1, perfectionist, firstborn. Like, I love a formula. So if I do this and this, then this should happen. And it just didn't. The hardest part, I think, is the way that sometimes it's hard within our Christian culture to be a single person, especially in like church culture. Churches are kind of designed to serve young families, and which is beautiful. And I love young families. I mean, I love kids, and I love getting to love on other people's kids. And yet the church can be one of the loneliest places for a single person. And I think that is where I struggle quite a bit, because in secular culture, there's actually this movement towards singleness, like it's more valuable, or people are getting married later. And so that's really confusing when you're like, the secular world is like cheering you on the singleness thing. The Christian world is like not really sure what to do with you because you're not married yet. And you're just like standing between these two cultures, neither of which really knows what to do with you. And you're also struggling to be like, no, I'm a cool person who's kind and interesting, and and my worth is not tied to my marital status, but I feel like it should be. And so I think it gets complicated.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think about a couple different people in my life. As somebody who also is in church leadership, when I write a message, when I think about our programs, I'm like, is this hitting the same for someone? Like, are we really encompassing all of the people that walk into our doors and making sure that they feel loved and seen? If somebody has like a single person in their life, maybe what are like the do's and don'ts of like having a conversation with them? And I know this probably seems like so silly, but sometimes, like there's certain things like nobody wants that suggestion or asks like, when do you think you're getting married? Like that doesn't feel good. What would be those things, Molly, that maybe come to mind for you?
As far as like having a conversation, I think it's really important to remember that like, even if our marital status is not the same, we still have a lot in common. Ask me about karaoke, for heaven's sakes, right? Like, I think that's where it gets hard, where people are like, well, I can't talk about my kids because you don't have kids. And it's like, first of all, I love your children, so you can, but it's the fear or the discomfort, when in reality, like, I'm just another person. You don't have to treat me like that. Actually makes me feel like more of an outlier if you can't talk to me. And I also like really appreciate, because I'm still building community here. So like trying to make new friends and things like that. And I recently had someone ask like, how do you feel about like just coming over for dinner or hanging out like casually with my family, because they have kids and things like that. And I was like, honestly, I would love that. I personally would love to just be invited to go sit at the soccer game and hang out with you guys. I think we just want to be included. We want to be invited. And give us the chance to decline if we choose not to, rather than just like assume, oh, she's single and doesn't have children, so therefore she wouldn't be interested in this. I think that really just kind of perpetuates the loneliness a little bit. And I think the other thing is like, I don't need you to feel sorry for me, which on the one hand, like I appreciate it, but it also feels like this idea of like, well, it'll happen. You're okay. And I'm like, I know I'm okay. Like, I don't need to help convince you that I'm okay. I think that's where it gets a little hard too, or like feeling like I'm a project or a problem that needs to be fixed. And at the same time, I'm not shy to say, if you know someone who's really cool, like I'm happy to be fixed up as long as it's someone that you yourself would date if you were also single, right? Like that's always the caveat, because a lot of times it's like, well, he's single and breathing, so here, versus like, okay, let's talk about like some of those other standards that might be important, like compatibility. So
that's so good.
So yeah, some of
Thank you for stepping into that. Oh gosh, I love what you said about that, because again, we get so wrapped up in like going back to even like what you were going back into Indonesia, back into Bangkok. We are in our own bubbles. We don't realize our words matter. And, singleness isn't a sickness. People are thriving. So I would love to go back to at the very beginning. You said like the beginning of your parable was like, okay, God, what are we going to do? And I love that open-handedness of it, of not being so narrow, of just like, hey, what do you have for me? Because now that you are able to look back on your life, Molly, and you look back to Indonesia and to Bangkok, if you didn't have like that open mindset, like look at everything that God has done in your life. You know, it is beautiful. You have extreme karaoke in there. You have Mabel, you know, all of these like beautiful things and moments. And thank you so much for sharing just a small part of your story with us today and helping us hold the tension of those two things. So if people wanted to get connected with you, how can they do that?
I'm on Instagram, so in a few different places, but Miss Molly Violet is my Instagram handle. I'm a school psychologist. I have a school psych account as well. So Molly, the school psych. And then my sisters and I also have a podcast that we do called A Word with the Girls. And we put it out just about every week. And it's really precious and so much fun and mostly an excuse for us to just hang out weekly. But, it's fun to get to invite people into that too.
Molly, thank you so much for sharing your story, and go check out their podcast. It is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much.
There were so many great takeaways from our conversation with Molly. My favorite was just holding on to that duality of life, holding on to those two things, walking in that tension. Even though I don't want to do that, that is usually the case, right? To connect with Molly, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Molly. Number 1, asking the question, okay, God, what are we going to do? I think once we open ourselves up to the possibility, we never know where God is going to take us. So just being open and playful and mindful and welcoming to what God wants to show us, what he wants us to learn each and every day. Number 2, what are the 2 things that you are holding right now? I think it's just so helpful for us to name what those things are. Maybe it is hardship, but it is also hope. Maybe it is patience, but like Molly said, there's some confusion in there too. There's so many feelings. What are those things that you are holding on right now? Because it helps us frame that in a way that we can better understand it for ourselves going forward. If you like Molly's episode, a great compliment to hers is her middle sister, Emily Riley. She's on episode 126 called Letting Go of Pride. Also, thanks to my brilliant producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so great today. I'm so grateful that you took the time to spend it with us. Remember, your parable showcases how God will always provide you that space to learn from him. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.